Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining, or I should say good afternoon, depending where you are. Thanks for joining today's little edit with us broadcast. So today we're going to be editing a photo from Brandi Nicole. You might have seen us chatting on Instagram Live last night about her process on working with self-portraits. So if you missed that, you should be able to catch it up on our channel as well. So what we're going to do today, let's bring up capture one, and this is the shot we're going to edit. Now, as this is an edit with us session, you can download this file and have a go yourself as well. So the link to download it is in the description of this event as well. Now, we're currently only going out to Facebook, so if you were waiting around on YouTube, you might be out of luck because YouTube currently has an issue in Europe, so they're not receiving any data at the moment, unfortunately. So for those of you watching on Facebook, in the description you can find a link to download the file, get it into your own copy of Capture One and try out editing as well. So what Brandi actually did, and hi Brandi, because I know you're watching, she sent me the raw file and she also sent me a TIFF edit that she did as well. So I was kind of trying to get as close to that as possible, but not knowing what sneaky trick she did in Capture One and Photoshop, I'm not sure I'll be totally able to replicate it, but I should be able to get fairly close anyway. Also, if you have any questions, don't forget to throw them in the chat as well, and then we do our best to answer those too. Okay, so let's go to our raw file. This is how it came out of camera. Now, as Brandi is shooting tethered, she can monitor the shot, so things like exposure, white balance, all that kind of stuff is pretty well nailed. So we're just going to do a few tweaks with some skin tone things and some general kind of basic editing as well. So first of all, before we get to the skin tone and basic stuff, Brandi likes to keep her edits fairly sort of low in contrast, which is kind of the opposite of what I generally do. So I'm well and truly out of my comfort zone with this one, so I shall do my best. Okay, so first of all, normally what I would do would be to auto the levels to some extent, but that's actually going to bring up the contrast and we want to keep it nice and flat. So I'm actually going to leave the levels where they are. Now, highlight wise, if we look at Brandi's shoe, the highlights are holding fine, but what I will do just to kind of also keep that lower contrast as well is bring the white slider down, and then that would just bring, you see, a little bit more density back like so, but it doesn't really have too much of effect on anything else. And if I do want to bring anything back, then we can handle that locally later. So that's the first step, just to bring those back in. Second step, in terms of general contrast and everything else, if I was looking at the final TIFF that Brandi produced, contrast wise, we're actually pretty good as we are. So I'm just going to really leave those as is, but I might just bring the blacks down a tiny bit, just so we actually we keep that low contrast, but then we get a bit more kind of rich density in the blacks as well. In terms of clarity, what I might do is actually go in the opposite direction. So I'm just going to go slightly negative, because that's again going to soften our contrast off a little bit. But not going to affect, you know, that edit that I just did with the black. So generally I go in the opposite direction, but this way we're going to go negative. Now, when it comes to skin tone, sorry Brandi, we're going to zoom into a massive detail. Brandi is blessed with pretty immaculate skin, as you can see, but like everybody, we always have variations in our skin tone, especially when we look you know, to our face, to our hands, might be slightly different, legs, body, and so on can have some variation. So we can fix that quite easily with the color editor. Looks like Brandi walked into a coffee table, so the first thing we can do is grab our healing brush, go over to this nice bruise, and we're just going to block it out like so. Now, when I tried this yesterday, Capture One does a pretty good pick, as you can see, because sometimes it's a bit tricky with like that shadow line. If it didn't get this in the right place, you might have to pick up the source point and just move that around a little bit, but the actual pattern match Welcome back, everybody. Let's try that again, shall we? So sorry about that. I just had a complete system freeze up. I think my eGPU crashed, actually, which is what caused it. But anyway, let's dive straight back in to where we were. So all we had done was we had cleaned up a little bruise down here somewhere. Where is it? There we go. So we'd cleaned up our bruise and we'd done a few minor corrections on the background layer. Just reducing the whites to get some detail back in the shoes, bring the blacks down so we've got a bit of contrast, and we had a little bit of negative clarity as well. So that's as far as we got, and the next part was to look at skin tones. So as I said, let's just hide our browser for a second. Everyone has some slight variation in skin tone, certainly around different areas of the body. That's totally normal. Sometimes it helps to equalize or normalize these a little to a known target of your choice. So this is a job for the very excellent color editor. So we're going to go to the skin tone tab, but we're going to do this on a layer so we have a bit more control of over where we can do our skin tone edits. So I'm going to make a new field adjustment layer, and the reason why this is going to be a field layer is because it's going to allow us to dial in, if you like, our skin tone correction, and then we can choose where to brush it. So by adding that adjustment layer, and let's name it, we're going to call this skin, like so. And now we're going to affect the whole shot, but don't worry, we're going to do something that allows us to then target in particular specific areas. So let's hide our mask with M, go to our skin tone tool, and the first thing that we want to do is pick our target skin tone. So we're going to grab our picker over here, look around, and then I want to go for probably something like that. So as soon as I click on my target area, then you get a little triangle pops up in the skin tone tab of the tool. And the dot is our target skin tone. So that's the actual skin tone that we picked. Now what we're going to do using some of the tools is to normalize everything in this range to that picked skin tone. So everything in that triangle, as we drag our uniformity sliders, is going to be transformed to that pick point. So to make sure I catch everything, I'm just going to extend this a little bit, and then we're going to drag our hue all the way across to the right. Now straight away you can see what's happened. If I turn the skin tone layer off, you can see the color of Brandi's lips change. So everything in this color range is now transformed to the picked color. So that's great, of course, except for the areas where we don't want it. Now you've got two choices. You could grab an eraser brush and just kind of erase out the areas where you don't want it. I think that's a bit slower. So what we could do instead is kind of reset the mask and just brush it back in where we want it. But by doing it this way, we can play around with the sliders and kind of get to the point where we think it's about right. So hue will normalize the color. Saturation will, of course, normalize the saturation. And lightness, if we go too heavy on this one, that will just completely flatten everything off and ruin all of Brandi's lighting. So we want to go sort of just a little bit in between, because we don't want to break the modeling as it was, but it might help to just create a bit of evenness as well. So that's kind of like the most I'm ever going to go. So what I'm going to do is right click and say clear mask. So that's going to keep those skin tone edits, but it's going to get rid of the mask. So you see the lips are now back at their correct color. And now we can draw this back in using our brush. So with our brush tool, we want to keep this nice and light and soft because we don't want any big hard edges anywhere. So let's soften this off and make it a bit smaller. And we also want to bring this guy down the flow. So that will just control the rate at which the skin tone correction is built up. So if I want to correct an area heavily, I can do more brushing. If I want to just maybe change an area a slight amount, I can do a little bit, just a small amount of brushing. So if we go over just on the bridge of the nose and then the cheeks over here, for example, then we can just correct. Now it won't look like much is changing because it is quite subtle. Now if we go over on this area, right click just to make my brush bigger, and then we can be a bit more aggressive, and then that will just equalize out those colors nicely. Now if you press M, you can see where the mask is going, and if you want to see just the mask as itself without the picture distracting you, we can do Option M, and then now you can see the mask in grayscale. So you can see the brightest areas are where it's the strongest, and then the darker areas is where there's no mask, and then the kind of the grayscale area, that's, if you like, in between. So now we can go over anywhere. We could just pick up hands, for example, and then make my brush a bit smaller, and then just go over these points as well. Especially if you're cold as well, you can get more, you know, like red tones or magenta tones and so on. So if I turn on our before and after, and I'll zoom into 200%. So before on the left, after on the right. So if you look at this area, for example, you can just see how the skin tone is modified just a tiny amount, like so. And that's a pretty easy edit that any of you can do as well. So it doesn't require any sort of particular expertise to be able to do that. It's just a case of picking a decent skin tone and then varying your mask and just brushing it in subtly where you might need it. So we can just do a little bit here as well. Now I'm not being super accurate because it's kind of targeted to the skin, so it doesn't really require any crazy auto masking or anything like that. So here I can grab a bigger brush, and then we can just go over these areas and just take out any discrepancies at all. Now if you've got like a totally different tone to face and arms, legs and so on, there's no reason why I can't do another layer and have one layer for face, one layer for legs, one layer for arms, and so on and so forth. So it depends really. If you want to normalize everything, then you could use one layer. Said if you want to separate out the body parts, then you could do another layer just for legs, one for hands, and so on and so forth. Especially if you've got like a very more dramatic skin tone makeup on the face or something like that, which wouldn't make sense to kind of normalize to arms, legs and so on, then you could easily do that across another layer like so. So it's a pretty simple process, and if you need to make it stronger, you can bump up your uniformity sliders. If you feel you've gone too far, then you can always bring the opacity down, and then you can blend in the previous tone with the new tone. So super great tool. If we zoom out a little bit and we do Option M for our grayscale mask, there you go. There you can see exactly where that skin tone correction mask has been placed as well. And if you need to clean any of that up, then it's kind of easier to visualize in grayscale too. And there it is in the red. Simple. Okay. One thing I didn't do, I noticed I didn't crop actually. So let's grab our crop tool and let's just come in a little bit tighter, like so. And one thing I wanted to do, I noticed on Brandi's edit, her hair had just like a little bit more contrast. Now I don't want to add the contrast globally because on the background layer we actually did the opposite. So we pulled our whites down, made the blacks a bit richer. We didn't add anything in contrast. In actual fact, I could probably pull it back a tiny bit as well. But I noticed in Brandi's edit, her hair just had a little bit more contrast. So it'd be nice if we could just punch a little bit more back in there as well. So I'm going to make another filled adjustment layer. So again, that's going to fill the whole shot. So if I press M on my keyboard, you'll see it. So I'm going to rename this one hair contrast so we know what it's doing. And I'm going to play with my sliders to see exactly, and I'm kind of looking at this area and these bits here, just how we can get a bit more separation and definition, but without affecting the rest of the shot. Now, as this has a filled layer, we're going to see it on everything first, but we do a similar thing as we did with the skin tone to remove that mask and then brush it in where we want to put it. So I'm going to up the contrast a bit, and I'm also going to up the clarity and maybe even a little bit more. I don't want the blacks to go too dark, so we're going to lift those a little bit as well. So if we turn this layer off and back on, I can see what it's doing here. We've got a bit more shine and everything, but I only want to put it in this spot because it's affecting the global contrast quite a lot. So same as before, right click and say clear mask. There we go. Now we're going to grab our brush, and keep our flow nice and low again, and maybe make this a bit smaller, because if I want to build it up a lot, then I can brush more. So now we can just put our contrast in this spot, and if I only want to do a little bit, then it's just a short brush or mouse action or pen action or whatever you're doing. So I'm just going to kind of follow the hair pattern like so, and a little bit down here as well. And again, as it's building up slowly, it's hard for you to see the change, but if we turn the layer off and then back on, you can see just that little bit of extra shine. And if we turn our before and after on and wipe across before, after, it's subtle, but it's just like a little bit more contrast, which I thought looked nice as well. So to finish off, I'm sure you don't want to watch me laboriously heal all the little dust spots and things, but we can easily go back to our heal layer and then we can just target some dirt. All you need to do is wipe over the area and then Capture One will fix it. So there's actually a big crease here which might be a little bit trickier, but I can show you another trick using the skin tone tool, which won't fully correct this background paper, but it does help. And if you had a background paper that maybe the light wasn't quite right on it, or it had a bit of a kink or something like that, then you can actually use the skin tone tool to do some corrections as well. So if I just zoom out a second, we're going to make a new filled layer and we're going to call it background fix, like so. And we're going to use the skin tone tool again and pretty much do the same thing. So I can click on the background and think, well, I like the color of my background here, so I'm just going to normalize or pick that point. I'm going to make sure it's a little bit wider. And now as I drag hue across and saturation and lightness, you can see the change. So as I bring lightness across, it will pretty much make that background color universal, which may or may not be what you want to achieve, but sometimes if you do want to flatten off the background, then it can be really handy. So that's with no lightness and full lightness up, and you can see it's kind of brighter here on the background, but if we bring the lightness across, then it dims that brighter spot down and kind of matches it to the pick point. So if you do have a slightly uneven background which you want even, then the skin tone tool can fix that as well. Now obviously it's messing up Brandi because she's in a similar tonal range, so once again we could clear the mask and then you could brush that in wherever you wanted to. So if you wanted to fix some color issues with the background just around the bottom here, then we could paint that in and just along the side here and so on. I like the brighter spot there, so I wouldn't want to mess with that. But it's just worth noting, if you're shooting portraits or anybody on a background and you want to even up the background, then the skin tone tool can also do that as well as skin, which is pretty awesome. Okay, I'm just checking questions because I was in a flap from losing our stream, so I hadn't been keeping an eye on the questions. So Brandi says, it's fun not telling you what I did in the edit, but you're still figuring it out. Good. I don't know if you did that hair trick, but when I just looked at the overall shot on your TIFF, I haven't been looking at the TIFF, I just thought, you know, you've got relatively low contrast, but there's just a little bit more gloss in the hair. So that's where I thought, maybe that kind of makes sense. So as I said, I probably will never match your edit perfectly. I can't even match my own edits perfectly, so let alone anyone else's. Let's see. What about increasing the shadows in terms of opening them up or making them darker? Well, we could do either really. It's easy with the high dynamic range tool. So if we wanted to crush them a bit, we could go in that direction. If we wanted to open them up, we could go in this direction. So I did darken them a bit. Looking at Brandi's, she's got them relatively dark actually. So my instinct was to darken them off a bit, even though the rest of the shot was fairly low in contrast. So I think that's probably what I'd stick with as well. So, but you could go either way, but I think around here looks pretty good. Let's see, the final edit has decreased shadows contrast. The expert says, I'm sure it would look good with shadows increased, it's personal taste to decrease. Yeah, so I think you could really just go either way. And the nice thing about the black slider, it's really targeting those deeper tones. So if I pull the blacks, it doesn't affect a great deal other than those darker shadows. Now, if we pulled the shadows, I'm willing to bet we're going to see a bigger change in the coat and so on. So if we pull the shadows, then you see it's a slightly more universal change, whereas the blacks is really nicely targeted. It's funny, even though that's just a small slider we added in version 20, it really accelerates the editing process as well, because it just gives you so much more control. June says, you called the background fix the skin tone tool. Please clarify. Well, the skin tone tool is designed for working with skin tones, because the whole purpose of the skin tone tool is to create uniformity. So picking a target and then fixing errors of skin tone, which there's lots on mine, there's not so much on Brandi, to a chosen value, which we picked with the picker. Now, if your background paper has some variation which you don't want, then you can also use the skin tone tool to do that, because essentially you're picking a target color and saying make everything else in a similar range match that. So if you've got like dirt on your background, or it's kinked, or the lighting quite wasn't what you wanted, you can use it to flatten off a background quite nicely as well. If I was going to dodge and burn the skin, which tools would I use? That's a good question, actually. So I didn't spot if you'd done any dodging and burning, but if we wanted to, let's say, darken this bit a bit, I would make a, let's go for a slightly bigger layers tool. I would go for a new filled adjustment layer. And again, the reason why I'm filling it is so that we can see what we're going to do with it. So if we want to just darken this area off a bit, I would probably, just check we filled our layer, I would probably not use exposure because it can make the darker areas too dark relatively. I'd probably pull the brightness down a bit to something as dark as I would want to go. So I wouldn't want to go any darker than that, just looking at the rest of your skin. And then I would clear that, grab a brush, and then on a super low flow, really low and super soft, I would then gradually dodge that in if I wanted to, like so. And if it's coming in too fast, because that's too much now, we could either bring the opacity back, so if we turn this off and back on, or I would make my flow even lower and start again. So I would clear that mask, grab my brush, and then turn this down to like 2, make this a bit bigger, and then we could just darken the areas that we wanted to have. We can do a little bit on the cheek there, and so on. So really, I'm not the dodging and burning expert, but I think that is kind of the approach I would do. And then I'd do the opposite. If I wanted to kind of lighten this area a little bit, then I'd pick an adjustment that would make sense. Brightness, probably not exposure, maybe throwing in some high dynamic range as well. Like if we wanted to take this highlight down, then I might also throw in a bit of highlight control as well. So kind of being able to blend different exposures together would make sense. So now if we turn this one off, then we can just see the slight change in density if we go across like so. Now again, if we wanted to add to that, we could just grab our brush back and just keep throwing in a little bit more, but the low flow is the key really, because that allows us to build it up nice and slowly. There we go. Why ISO 250? I don't know, John. Maybe Brandi can answer us that. I mean, at ISO 250, you're shooting Nikon, aren't you, Brandi? So you're on a D850. So the difference between 100 ISO and ISO 250, you're not even going to see it. So if it's a case that it was convenient for the lighting, then I think that would make sense as well. So one thing we didn't do, let's just do a couple of tiny heel points. Everyone's going to be super jealous of your amazingly clear skin now, because pretty much that's all there is to it. Like so. Job done. Easy. There we go. So, oh, shush Alexa. If you want to have a go yourself. And of course, you don't have to follow my edits. You can of course download the file. It is an EIP format, which means it can only be read in Capture One because it's just bundled with an edit I did yesterday. It's not as extensive as this one. If I look back at the different edits, I think what you'll find is on the EIP file there's just an example of the skin tone adjustment. Maybe it's this one that's in the EIP, I'm not sure. But that's why it's an EIP, just because there's a couple of layers in there so you can see what the skin tone tool is doing and so on. So download that, put it in Capture One, and then you'll be able to see that. If you want to start from scratch, don't forget you can say image new variant, and that way you can just start again and then do your own edit and so on. And don't forget to share using the hashtag edit with us as well. All we have to do now is say thanks to Brandi for sharing a raw file with us. It's very rare we can get nice raw files, so thanks Brandi. And if you missed us on Instagram Live as well, go back and watch the replay. And if you're interested in learning how to shoot tethered, because this week we're featuring various different portrait artists on our Instagram, then on Thursday we have our webinar, which is going to be all about shooting tethered. So we're going to go through the process of connecting your camera, file management, live view, adjustments, the whole lot, start to finish. We're going to build up a little tethered shoot. All right, thanks for joining today, everybody. Sorry about the little glitch at the start, and sorry we could only go out on Facebook and not YouTube. But that's rare. Even the internet breaks every now and then. Take care, everybody, and see you again soon. Have a good one. Bye now.